Welcome back, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Georgia. So folks, we've had a wonderful morning. Thank you to Michael and to Kate for showing us around the nature and the natural heritage of Mayo. And now we're going to use the modern technology that we have available to us to travel not only through time zones and continents, but leaping right over to the Southern Hemisphere, where we have two lovely guests. We have Marnie Ogg and Fredwatson, and I'm just going to spotlight their video. There we are. Give us a wave, guys. Great. So just before I hand over the reins to both, just by way of introduction, we have, as I said, Marnie Ogg and Fredwatson. So Marnie has been very prominent in preserving our night skies globally. She has been working actually in dark sky tourism, bringing, when we could travel, bringing groups around the world to see phenomena like the aurora, and comets, and taking people all over the world. She's also responsible for establishing Australia's first dark sky park, which is a fantastic achievement back in 2016, I believe, Marnie. And more recently, she has founded the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance, which works to promote dark skies through policy and lighting guidance. So they do great work there, and something we can all learn from that, Marnie. And moving on to Fred. Hi there, Fred. So we have double trouble this morning. Her partner in crime, Fredwatson, who is Australia's Astronomer-at-Large, a very prestigious position. And Fred has for many years now been an award-winning TV and radio presenter in astronomy. And I was just reading in his biography there, he's had an asteroid named after him, and I was going to read the name of it, but I didn't write that down, Fred. But and Fred has said that he won't accept any responsibility for it hitting the Earth. So I think on that note, I will hand you over, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm delighted to see you both, and over to you for Noctis Australis.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much, Georgia.
Yeah, go for it, Marnie.
I'll share screen.
Marnie's working the buttons and things. There we go. Now you should be able to see an array of dishes pointing at the Milky Way. If anybody can't see that, let me know. Preferably by postcard, that would do fine. So that's our title slide, Noctis Australis. It is about Australian astronomy and dark skies. And as you've heard, we're a double act. That's me. I work for the Australian government. As you've heard, I'm the nation's Astronomer-at-Large, which I should explain is an outreach and advocacy role. There's a kind of grown-up element to it, as well as talking about astronomy all the time. But it is something I don't let anybody hear me say this, but I'd probably do it whether they paid me or not. It's just great to work in this field. And I have a few university affiliations as well. On the other hand, the person next to me is...
Me, Marnie. So yeah, this is two talks spliced together and a little bit of interaction between Fred and myself. We've never done this before, so it's a bit of a double act. But yeah, so that's me. As Georgia mentioned, I've been working with Fred mostly for about the last 15 years doing dark sky tourism. Was involved with the creation of the Warrumbungle National Dark Sky Park, and like Georgia, won the Dark Sky Defender Award with the International Dark Sky Association. I will go into this a little bit later, but I will talk a little bit about the Riding the Light Wave of Technology, which was the first dark sky conference that was held in Australia. I'm a member of several dark sky committees, and as Georgia said before, I'm the CEO of the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance. But let's kick it off with Fred.
Thank you, Marnie.
Doing most of the talking. Oh, I forgot to say, I'm a Mayo Dark Sky Park enthusiast. Having been there 2 years ago, nearly, we were delighted to take astrophotographer David Malin up to the Dark Sky Park there and have Georgia show us around and experience a wonderful magic show. It's one of the, honestly, without bluffing, one of the highlights of my life. So we will come back to dark skies in Australia, but to Fred and Australian astronomy.
Yes, let's start with this beautiful portrait of the emu in the Milky Way, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second or two. But it reminds me that, as is the custom here in Australia, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're speaking. And in our case, Marnie and my case, it's the Guringai people of northern Sydney. And we, as always, pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The great thing about Aboriginal astronomy, of course, is that people have been doing what we do professionally in the world of Australian astronomy for tens of thousands of years. So there's a direct and natural link there. But what's the emu in the sky? This is an image of the night sky made, as many of these are these days, by a very gifted amateur astronomer. And on the left, you can see the Milky Way. You might, if you've got good screens there, be able to detect the Southern Cross, which is a little bit above center, almost on the left-hand edge. But the emu is that dark, its head is that dark cloud of dust, as we know it now, which we in the Western tradition call the coal sack, but to Aboriginal people, it is the head of the emu, and its neck and body run down through the dust clouds of Scorpius. And when it rises on May evenings, it is truly spectacular. We've got a bit of video later on that I hope will show you that. The two blobs on the right are the large and small Magellanic Clouds, our nearest neighbor dwarf galaxies. Let me just say a little bit from the point of view of a professional astronomer about the way we see the universe here. This is an overhead view of a place called Siding Spring Observatory. It's right next to the Warrumbungle National Park, now the Warrumbungle Dark Sky Park. I lived in this area for a quarter of a century, and the building in the middle is the Anglo-Australian Telescope Dome. It's very large. It's the equivalent of a 17-story building. And what it makes it special is the place. I'll say a little bit more about the telescope in a second, but the place where it is, because we in Australia have real advantages when it comes to studying the universe, the latitude advantage. So we can see things like the center of our galaxy, the Milky Way. We can see those Magellanic Clouds that you just saw. There are things called globular clusters, which we see very well from the south. And it has long been known that Southern Hemisphere astronomy can teach us things about the universe that you can't see from the north. That's not meant in any way to be a criticism, it's just the way it is. We also, though, have a longitude advantage, because if you think about the way the world is, most of the Southern Hemisphere is ocean. And so there are three bits that stick down into the ocean: Australia, South Africa, or Southern Africa, and South America. And all of those places have got telescopes. So between us, we can sort of cover the whole, the whole of the sky at any given time. And that is important for certain classes of object. We've got pretty stable atmospheric conditions. They're not as stable as the best Southern Hemisphere sites, which are in southern Chile, and I'll get there again in a second. But we do have marvelously dark skies. We've got the sky at Siding Spring Observatory is pretty well as pristine as it was when the first people watched the sky there from probably 40, maybe even longer, 1,000 years ago. And we also, just switching to radio astronomy for a minute, we've got the most radio quiet site on the planet. So that's another picture of the Anglo-Australian Telescope Dome. It's the largest building for about 200 miles in any direction. You see it here decked out with a red ribbon, which was Marnie's idea to celebrate its 40th birthday back in 2014. And I always tell people that I've spent so many years working inside that building that I've actually started to look like it, not with the walkway around the outside, but certainly with the ball top. So there it is. It's in New South Wales. What's inside it? This gigantic instrument here, dwarfing somebody you might have heard of, Brian Cox, who was with us for some Stargazing Live TV productions a few years ago. There he is at the back, looking very small. The telescope has a mirror 3.9 meters in diameter. It's more or less, well, you can't see me, but it's about twice my height if you could stand it up next to me. It was built jointly by the British and the Australian, hence its name, and it still does world-class science. It's very important in the field of what we call spectroscopy, the analysis of light from stars and galaxies and quasars and asteroids and other things to find out what they're made of. But Australian astronomy has, like all astronomers, Australian astronomers suffer from something called aperture fever, which is that no matter how big a telescope you've got, you always want a bigger one. And we have wanted bigger ones for a long time. And oh, sorry, I forgot. I was going to show you these pictures. I forgot to show you this. I was just going to say that this is a historic telescope, been going for 40 years. That is a picture taken of the then night assistant called Robert Dean operating the telescope in 1974. Some things do change and some things don't change. That's Robert Dean now at the same control console, which has been upgraded a bit. So the telescope has moved on in terms of developing its instrumentation. That's why it still can do world-class science. And actually, Rob Dean, I was talking to him on the radio this morning. He now does world-class radio broadcasting from the days as a night assistant. What I was going to say is that we now have access in Australia to another facility, a major facility called, there are 4 telescope domes there, which jointly are known as the Very Large Telescope, the VLT. And they're operated by the Europeans. You'd think they'd have a more European name, but they don't. The Very Large Telescope is 4 8.2 meter diameter telescopes. So each one of those is twice the size of our Anglo-Australian telescope. Back in 2017, the Australian government forged a strategic partnership with the European Southern Observatory so that we have this membership, and it allows Australian astronomers to access those facilities. These are the world's finest Southern Hemisphere optical telescopes on what is the Southern Hemisphere's finest site. We can't match the conditions here in Australia, so we have to go overseas. I'm delighted to say that you in Ireland are also a member state of the European Southern Observatory. Irish astronomers joined back in September 2018. So we actually beat you to it, although we're not full members because we're not in Europe. We are actually a strategic partnership. So those telescopes allow Australian astronomers to probe really into the depths of the universe. And we also have or will have access to this machine, which is another South American telescope. This picture, if you can see the details, this is an instrument called the Giant Magellan Telescope, still being built. Although because of COVID-19, there's not much happening on the site at the moment, although the engineering is going on. We have a 10% share in that. Its effective diameter is 23 meters. And the way it works, it has 7 mirrors which act as one mirror, and you can kind of see them in the picture. They're arranged like flower petals, but each one of those mirrors will be 8.4 meters in diameter. So this will be one of the world's most powerful instruments. Just turning, though, if I may, to something in its own way even more powerful, and this is moving away from dark skies and the night sky as we think of it, but there is a direct parallel between protecting the site, and I should have mentioned that one of the things that we have been especially active in is protecting the site of the Anglo-Australian telescope in order to stop any developments that bring light pollution. That was work that Marnie and I did back in the early along with the Department of Planning and other government departments back in the 2010s, I should say, the early 2010s. So that legal protection of these sites is important. And that brings me to this curious looking array of things vaguely like Christmas trees. They look even more like Christmas trees now, which is going to be, when it's completed in the late 2020s, half of the biggest telescope in the world. It's an instrument called the SKA, a very uninspiring title, but it stands for the Square Kilometer Array. Those logos you can see underneath there are the Australian entities that are involved with that, but it is actually an international project, as you might be able to see on this map. There are actually 15 nations participating, of which there are basically 7 founding nations signing treaties and things of that sort. That's the grown-up stuff that I was telling you is part of my job, to be involved with some of that. But the telescopes are going to be, first of all, the one I've just shown you, an artist's impression of, will be in Western Australia, which is, as I've mentioned already, one of the most radio quiet places in the world. There is another half of the telescope which looks quite different because they're antennas rather than Christmas trees. They are in South Africa. And the difference between these two sets of telescopes, and they're both big arrays, is that one, and the Australian one, works at lower frequencies than the South African one. So the radio frequency is very important in terms of what radio astronomy you look at. You can think of it almost like color. So if we in Australia look at the red frequencies, in South Africa, they look at the green and blue frequencies, if you think of it that way, as wavelength being equivalent to color in light. There is a third country involved. It is called the United Kingdom, and that's why there's an arrow there as well, because the headquarters for this organization is at Jodrell Bank in not far from Manchester. So far, we don't have Irish participation, but I'm sure one day we will, because there are radio astronomers in Ireland too who are interested in this kind of thing. We don't need to look at that, but let me show you a little bit of what the site is. It's a place called the Murchison Radio Astronomy Observatory in Western Australia. As I've said there, building Australian radio astronomy facilities on the world's quietest radio astronomy site. So whereas you don't want flashlights being shone around when you're on a dark sky site, we don't want mobile phones around when we're on a radio astronomy site, or microwave ovens for that matter, anything that can emit radio waves. And in fact, it's protected by a 520 kilometer, or the 325 miles as I put there, diameter radio quiet zone. So this is very like the dark sky region we have surrounding the observatory at Siding Spring that I showed you right at the beginning. Only this is for a radio astronomy site. Western Australia is very big. There's a lot of land like that that is pretty empty. And I should mention that it's the Wadjuri people who are the traditional owners of this land, and the organization that's building the Square Kilometer Array works very closely with Wadjuri people on that. So the versions of this telescope, as it's been developed, have changed slightly in their appearance. This is a prototype for the Square Kilometer Array, and you might think, what on earth is that? It doesn't look anything like a telescope. And maybe you'll get a better idea in a minute of how it really relates to telescopes, because these are antennas. They are very like a kind of hyped up 21st century version of the old TV antennas that we all used to have on our roofs. So it's looking at relatively low frequencies. And the great thing is, if you have enough of these, and the Square Kilometer Array will have 130,000 of them, then you can steer the beam around in the sky. You basically can look almost at the whole sky at once, not quite, but you can look at very wide areas of sky. And as I've said there, there'll be 130,000 antennas covering, you don't need to worry about the frequency band, that's low frequencies in radio astronomy, but it's over an area 65 kilometers in diameter. The thing that boggles the imagination is that the data rate of this telescope, when it's operating from probably about 2028 or thereabouts, will be 10 times today's total global internet traffic. It will be phenomenal. And this is an image of the latest design of these Christmas tree antennas. So yeah, you've got to think of 130, it's actually 131,000 of these spread across Western Australia, really just sitting there on the ground. There's a slightly, you might notice if you're keen-sighted, that picture on the left of the prototype, which was built probably about 7 or 8 years ago. Each one of those antennas sits on a concrete base, and those concrete bases are actually the surrounds of telephone manhole covers that were bought secondhand from British Telecom as a job lot. astronomers always do things on the cheap if they can, but they were just too heavy. And to get 130,000 of them would have probably bankrupted the project, which is why that new design of antenna on the right, with me standing right behind it, that's why that is sitting on a grid of mesh. The other thing that is important with this work is the mega computation that you need to change these signals into the scientific results. And so you might ask, well, what is the science that this telescope is going to do? And the great thing about astronomy is that we always have the facility to look into the distant past because of the speed of light. So you all know that when we look at the sun, we're seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago because of the light travel time. When we look at the nearest star, which is actually in our southern skies, that's about 4 years behind. The nearest big galaxy, you're looking back about 2 million years, but we can look billions of years, literally, back into the distance. The joke I always use is that if you look at me, you're looking straight back to the 1960s, but that's a quite different phenomenon from the one we're talking about. So what this diagram shows, and I've nearly finished my bit, Marnie's waiting, ready to go. This diagram shows the expansion of the universe over its 13.8 billion year history, and the Square Kilometer Array, and also some of these optical facilities, the visible light facilities, like the Very Large Telescope, like the Anglo-Australian Telescope, they can probe back almost to the beginning. As I've said there, it will explore the whole history of the universe. The flash on the left is the Big Bang, which we know happened because we can still see its effects in the radio spectrum. There was a period after that where there were no stars shining. It's before the first stars came into being. We call it the Dark Ages, and the Square Kilometer Array will probe that region very accurately and tell us what conditions were like and how the universe evolved to the right-hand side to be like it is today. And so the summary of this is from the Dark Ages to before the first stars lit up to today's galaxies, like that one you can see, which is actually an artist's impression, but it's a rather nice animation. And I think on that happy note, I hand over to my partner in crime, who's standing right next to me. Yay. There you go. Come on.
Thank you very much, Fred. Are you going to be right standing there in the corner?
I'll move it.
Okay, so thank you very much, Fred. And we're going to take this conversation in a bit of a different direction, but still related. The image that you're seeing right now in front of you has been taken at Siding Spring Observatory. And what Fred didn't tell you is the meaning of Warrumbungle. So you may remember from Fred's drone photo that the mountains were all crooked, and that's what Warrumbungle means. It means crooked mountains. So this image taken by Ankel Lopez Sanchez, one of Fred's colleagues at the Anglo-Australian Observatory. So as Fred mentioned, he was involved very much in the legislation for Siding Spring Observatory. And that came about with guidelines for good lighting around the observatory, where basically every building, every structure, everyone that lives there within a 200-kilometre radius has guidelines as to how many lights they can have outside their house. And the closer you get to the observatory, the fewer lights and the fewer, the warmer the lights, etc. In that region. So that made it very easy for us to take the first steps into creating a dark sky park. And that was how I really became involved with the dark sky movement. In fact, there's 3 dark sky places in Australia, and I will go into those in a second. So what's my story and how did this, Fred's fiddling around in the background. How did it all come about? Well, Fred and I got together for a 2012 solar eclipse in Australia, but along the way we decided that we would take a tour group to South America, and so this whole astrotourism business grew from not from a whim, but from a desire to take people to remote places where they could see the night sky. And so here we are standing in Sweden, in Abisko National Park, looking at the aurora one night. And that's probably one of 6 trips we've done up to the Arctic because we just love it so much. And as I said before, we've been to County Mayo, we've done South Africa, we've done southern Chile, all sorts of wonderful places. But what I noticed was that when we came back to Australia, we still had some of the darkest skies, and I didn't see anyone really understanding the value or the asset that we had in Australia. So I set about helping Fred put together the Warrumbungle Dark Sky Park application, started to learn what good lighting means, and it basically culminated about in 2018, was it? I can never, I'm awful with dates. September 2018, with this conference taking place at Siding Spring Observatory. So at that stage, we had one dark sky place in Australia, the Warrumbungle National Park, which we were all standing in there at Siding Spring Observatory. And 100 people got together to talk about light pollution in Australia. And we had a couple of international guests there as well. We had ecologists, we had lighting industry professionals, we had policymakers, we had tourism specialists, we had astronomers, we even had astronomers. They were allowed in. And what we decided after this 3-day conference was that there were so many people doing wonderful things all across this huge country. Now, let's just put it into perspective. Australia, if you know where Tasmania is in Australia, the whole of Ireland will just fit into Tasmania. So you've got a continent that's about, I think it's 110 times the size of Ireland. I looked up this afternoon. So you've got all these disparate voices all around the country trying to do wonderful things with light pollution, but they weren't talking to each other. They weren't talking. They might be talking to their local council, but what we decided was that we needed a body in Australia that could do this collectively. And that's how the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance was formed. So as I said, it was started off the 2019 Light Pollution Conference. It was actually 2018. We've been going, the organisation itself, the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance, is a charity. And we've been going since February last year. What we wanted to do was not just talk to people, but to really amplify the messages of what people are doing here. And one of the things that we were successful in doing this year was to become Guinness World Record holders. And I think there's a few of you in this audience tonight that actually participated in that attempt to actually map light pollution and show the hotspots and dark spots, which Australia is still relatively dark if you can see through the writing there and see our country from space at night. And so we're a volunteer-led organisation trying our very best to deal with a very big continent. Actually, it's not just Australia, it's New Zealand and some of the Southern Pacific Islands as well. So one of the things that actually helped us come to fruition was a program called the ADSA Approved Lighting Scheme. So what we actually did was go about creating a tiered structure of certification so that the councils could actually say, because this is what was happening, we were getting often the question, well, we want to make a change, but we don't know what lights we can use. And, you know, there's so many lighting companies out there now saying they've got night sky friendly lighting or night sky sensitive lighting, as we like to call it, but there's no one saying, well, how does this compare to the other? You know, there wasn't a certification scheme. So that's what we went ahead and created. And we're finding that to be very, very important. Councils are really jumping onto that and really very keen to understand what lights they can and can't use. And we're hoping to sort of build into that a home sensitive lighting range as well. As I said at the beginning, we've got 3 dark sky places now, and you can see those on the map with the red crosses. Fred says it looks like I was blocking them out, so I'm sorry.
Blocking out the light.
But the top one up the top there is called the Australian Age of Dinosaurs, and I will show you an image of that. We've got one down in South Australia in the River Murray, and you might have heard of the Murray, the grand old Murray River, and then the Warrumbungles there to the right. But you can see from this little suns there that we've got a lot of others that are discussing it and very keen on adopting the principles. And as I'm sure you've discovered, once you have one, you start to have lots of others. And that actually is wonderful. The ripple effect from creating dark sky places is enormous. What you might be able to see, which I can't see because of the way the screen is a yellow circle around New Zealand there. And what I think is absolutely astounding, and I really wish them all the very best with this, and they're very far along the progress, is to actually become the first dark sky country. So not just a park or a place or a reserve here and there, but to actually make the whole country dark sky sensitive and friendly. So as I said, this is a picture taken at the River Murray, and this is our largest dark sky place. It's a reserve in South Australia. And what's lovely with this is that people can actually hire houseboats and cruise down the river looking at the night sky. And relating it to our last speaker, they actually do bat walks through this area as well. Oh, and then the Australian Age of Dinosaurs. Well, the name gives it everything. What I think is lovely with this is that it is truly wonderfully dark. I have had the experience of driving back on the road at night and being confronted with this wall of darkness. But what you can, so whilst you have this wonderful dark sky at night, you actually have a fantastic museum with dinosaur footprints, bones. It's a huge dinosaur grave. So it's great for kids, a really fantastic destination. And when I heard they were coming online with a dark sky place, I was particularly excited. And then this one isn't yet designated as a dark sky place, but is somewhere that is near and dear to Fred and myself. In fact, if you were to draw a straight line directly behind that telescope, no, actually the other way, doesn't really matter. We're about a 12-kilometre radius away from that lighthouse. That's the word I'm looking for. And we're hoping that this will become Australia's first urban night sky place. So a designation that is given to an area within a 50-kilometre radius of a city. And particularly, you know, it demonstrates good lighting principles. It doesn't necessarily have pristine night skies, but as you can see from that image, we're pretty bloody lucky to have the night sky that we have so close to the city. And it's a lot of it's, particularly in that situation, is related to the fact that it's surrounded by sea. This is an isthmus with ocean and river on one side and the ocean on the other. So lovely and dark still. So a lot of times I get the question, so how do you fit in with the IDA? Well, right from the very beginning, we launched ourselves as collaborating with the IDA. So we have an MOU in place. Some of you may know Dr. Kelly Pendoli, who's based in Western Australia, who does turtle research, has been doing R&D around lighting implications, particularly around mine sites in Western Australia. So she's on our board, so she's got that direct link into the IDA. And really what we keep saying is that what we're doing is sending the IDA's message out on a local basis, but acting on a global scale. So we spend a lot of time on conference calls with the IDA and working out how we can work closely together. And if you're wondering where that image is, it is not in Australia, it is the Grand Canyon, but I just thought it was a fabulous photo. So as I said, the biggest thing that we've been able to achieve this year was to run World Record Light, where we had 4 weeks to put on an event. The Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment came to us and said, we have federal light pollution guidelines and we don't really know how to get the message out there. What could you do? And I think they thought we might hold a little, seminar online or whatever. We decided to create the Guinness World Record attempt on the darkest day of the year in the Southern Hemisphere. We hoped to get 2,000 people sign up. We had 11,000 people sign up. But really what was, whilst we were very lucky, we had it was right between two periods in Australia. We had a very strict COVID lockdown. We had a period of about 6 weeks where we were able to get out and do things, and then we started to lock down again. But that 6-week period in the middle actually was when this happened. And so people were really keen to get outdoors and do things and be with their family. And that's what the feedback was that we got. We had just so many lovely comments from families saying, I hadn't even stood outside with my children ever before. We couldn't stop ourselves. We had to go on. We had to stay out a lot longer. And that's the message. We know that we've created another generation of night sky gazers. And this is the map of dark and light shaded areas in Australia. So as you can see, not too much of a surprise to see major cities being the brightest areas, but we will build on this. So we will do this year in and year out and just see how it keeps changing, hopefully to the darker. So that kind of brings us to the end of our talk, except that we have a short video which we might just start playing, and we thought we would talk to you just to show you the Warrumbungle Dark Sky Place, and as seen through Ángel López Sanchez's eyes with this wonderful video.
Sounds good.
So, as I was saying to Fred, you might think that that's the ocean, but that's actually the Western Plains of New South Wales. It's dead flat, so that's the sun setting into New South Wales. And
yeah, that's actually a view across the top of the mountain. There's some of the telescopes right at the top there, with of course the moon and Venus. And this is taken from the top of Siding Spring Mountain. The Anglo-Australian Telescope Dome is on the right. The little town you can see in the background is Coonabarabran, the nearest town, which is 20 kilometres away and is pretty dim on the horizon. That's a telescope called the United Kingdom Schmidt Telescope. I was the astronomer-in-charge of that and the Anglo-Australian Telescope for 20 years, which is why I know the place well. And here's the moon setting with the Pleiades and the Hyades coming down. There is the head of the Emu just rising next to the Southern Cross, which you probably can't make out because there are so many stars there. But look at the way that Emu neck curves right down to the body in the constellation of Scorpius. And here's the Emu going the other way. It's upside down now, lying on its back. The dark silhouette in the foreground there is something called the Sky Mapper telescope. And on the right, the two Magellanic Clouds are rising, the two little smudges of light you can see going up on the right, the nearest big dwarf galaxies to our own. More galactic pictures.
If I can just say, that's the body of the Emu, and it's not very obvious at the moment. What the Aboriginal people knew was, depending on where the Emu was in the sky during the year, they knew what to do. So when the Emu was actually sitting on the horizon, it was when it was laying its eggs. When it was chasing across the sky, it was when it was in season. And they just had these fabulous stories and knew when to hunt, etc.
And you can just, there's a zodiacal light, that light that's rising above the horizon there, something that's very difficult to see from Great Britain and Ireland. I have seen it once, but it's dust in the solar system being lit by the sun's light. The bright pink star hydrogen clouds of the galactic center region above the Anglo-Australian Telescope Dome as the Milky Way sets. And here's a different type of telescope. This is a thing called it's usually called the 2.4 meter, but it's actually the Advanced Technology Telescope was its name, once again with the Milky Way setting behind it. And so many stars, it's really quite hard to pick out the constellations. Here's the Emu setting, that's the body of the Emu, its neck is going off to the left against the Anglo-Australian Telescope. But look at the way the trees are silhouetted against the night sky itself, and you can see that greenish glow in the night sky, which comes about because of actually oxygen and hydrogen atoms relaxing after a hard day in the sun. There again, the two Magellanic Clouds with the Milky Way rising over one of the other telescopes at Siding Spring. Yes, that's the 18. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah. And here's the moon rising. And you can tell it's the moon and not the sun because there's still stars there with the planet Venus next to it. Once in a while, you might see something we don't see very often these days, which is called an aeroplane. And there's the Sky Mapper telescope at the end of the night with Angel's trick of making star trails out of his individual shots. Ángel López Sanchez, as Marnie said, very gifted astrophotographer. Venus and probably Mars and the Pleiades and Orion coming up there, of course, upside down in our latitudes. There again is the 2.4 meter telescope doing its thing faithfully during the night. These are moonlight images, which is why you can see the blue of the sky. Sky is blue, believe it or not, when it's lit up by the moon, just as it is during the day. And that's dawn and the end of our talk. And the end of our talk as well, yeah. We didn't play the music, sorry about that.
You didn't need it. That was fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. I mean, wow isn't a strong enough reaction. So to that. We've got lots of comments coming in and questions, so I might you're the perfect combination, by the way, the pair of you. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. So I'm going to dive straight into some of the questions and answers here. So we have Colette Taylor. What impact have the devastating bushfires had on the observing in Australia?
Well, I can mention that because you're quite right. Back in 2013, there was an event called the Wombalong bushfire, which decimated 53,000 hectares, which is some bigger number of acres, probably about 150,000, if I remember rightly, acres of the Warrumbungle National Park. So it had an impact on the park itself. It denuded it. The impact on the observatory, we were very fortunate in that the fire swept over the observatory. There was water bombing going on by the Rural Fire Service, which kept the fires away from the domes themselves. So we didn't lose any telescopes. We did, however, lose the Siding Spring Lodge, which was the kind of motel accommodation that was there for astronomers to use when they were working. And in fact, the insurance has built a new Siding Spring Lodge. Sadly, most astronomers...
Where you can come and stay.
Yeah, you can. Most astronomers do their observing remotely now. So Marnie's involved with turning that into a tourist venture. The fire was terrifying.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I was just going to talk about where we were when this fire was going on.
So no, go ahead. I just thinking they're asking about the fires most recently now, though. That's all.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. Okay. Well, all right. The more recent ones have not affected the Warrumbungle National Park. But so just to track back a bit, back in 2013, 13th of January, a day etched on all our minds. But I was the astronomer-in-charge, so I was kind of responsible. But at the time, I was on leave, leading one of Marnie's Arctic Aurora tours. So we're in far northern Norway when I was getting all these messages on the phone about the observatory being at risk of burning down. And I do lots of radio interviews over the phone anyway, but the one I did that day was the weirdest I've ever done, because we were, with our tour group, we were on a dog sled expedition. And Marnie was driving and I was sitting on it. And I had to do this live radio interview in temperatures of about -15 Celsius, about things going on the other side of the world at +40 degrees Celsius. And Marnie had to keep the dogs going because otherwise they stop and start barking because they just want to keep going with the sledge. Very strange. Over to you, Marnie.
No, but I think they certainly the last bushfires, which we were actually again away in the Arctic, believe it or not.
Yes.
For the majority of
the beginning of this year.
We certainly know that the observatory's closed down just because of smoke.
Yes.
The smoke was everywhere.
I think that's one of the points alluded to by Terry Mosley. He's also asked the question: does the smoke and soot particles affect the astronomical viewing? So yeah.
It certainly would do. That's right. So you shut down.
Okay, great, guys. We've another one from Hannah Dalgleish. How are the telescopes powered? Are they run on fossil or renewable fuels? She's saying especially the SKA, since it will require so much energy. So very, very relevant question for today's times.
If I'd had time, I would have shown you an image of the solar array that is right next to the Square Kilometer Array, and will probably, the stage it is at the moment, it will probably provide about 1/3 of the power that's required, with the rest actually being diesel in the case of the SKA, because it's so far, it's so remote, there aren't any mains power lines. So it is certainly the aim of the SKA organization to make it completely sustainable, so that all the electricity is solar generated. And of course, in a country like Australia, it's a no-brainer to use solar power. So that will happen. You're quite right to point out the extraordinary power demands of the computation that is needed to turn these faint signals from the sky into usable scientific results. So very important. Sadly, Siding Spring runs on mains power, which is actually at present from fossil fuel burning. One day it will change, but not this week.
I was just going to say, you may have noticed from Fred's photo when he was in that with the Christmas tree, the big black clouds behind. Yes. So the only day that it ever rained was the day that Fred was.
Well, we're used to big black clouds here, but for a different reason. We have another question here, very relevant one from Jed Dowling. When we can travel again, we should set up an exchange program between Warrumbungle and Mayo Dark Sky. I think that's an excellent idea, Jed. Do you think this could be a possibility?
Absolutely. In fact, it's something I'm very keen to do because, as Fred was just mentioning, the lodge, the old lodge at Siding Spring burnt down. And our aim is to actually slowly create a space that's safe for tourism, but also allow science to take place on the site. And so we need people that are very, very mindful. You know, we can't just get any old hotelier, no offense to hotel managers, etc., because my background's in tourism. But we need that understanding, that really rich understanding of what dark sky friendly means. And so one of the thoughts I had was to actually have a global exchange program where people could come out, do a month at Siding Spring Observatory, show guests around, etc., and we could do an exchange program. And I think that is really enriching, not just for a tourism venture, but on a cultural venture. And I think, Georgia, you and I have talked previously about how that richness of the night sky with culture, which we haven't touched on at all with our talk tonight.
No,
but
we haven't.
yeah.
Well, we are closing that gap a little bit, and as we have the theme with ourselves and with the IDA event coming up, the under one sky is so relevant for these types of events. And that actually brings me to another point. You mentioned the IDA several times, and I was conscious that a lot of people on this webinar may not be familiar with the IDA, and in Ireland it actually has a different connotation. So would you like to give a very quick overview of the IDA, or one of
Marnie's had more to do with the IDA than I have.
The International Dark Sky Association is based in Tucson and has been basically started with a couple of people, two gents, one who had an interest in amateur astronomy, who put up a telescope in his backyard, and he started to see that they were putting new streetlights in along the way around his house, and losing the night sky. And he went to the professional astronomers at Kip Peak and said, you know, do you realise that there's these streetlights going in, and you know that's going to lose the night sky, and blah blah blah. Anyway, together they created the International Dark Sky Association, and for 30 years they have been progressively doing more and more work, and so what started as a purely astronomical venture is we're now talking about loss of culture, as we've just said, loss of habitat for wildlife species. But more than anything, the IDA are have this fantastic program of creating dark sky places around the globe, and I think that above everything else that they do has had the most influence in changing people's mindsets, bringing people to the movement. And so when we put in our Dark Sky Park application, I think there were 79 places. There's now 150, and that's in 5 years. And so, as I said, this is a rapidly growing project. And what was working in Tucson and then America and then in the Northern Hemisphere just didn't really relate to what was happening in the Southern Hemisphere, which is why we started. I actually approached IDA and said, I think you need a voice in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's kind of where it's going. But the IDA is very much looking at trying to make it a much more international influence, so that it's not just an American program. Yeah.
Great. And as you say, it's growing. That does. Thanks, Marnie. And as you say, it's growing so rapidly. So, and we'll hear more about the IDA later today. So thank you for that. I'll just throw another, I'll just pick a question from a different person. We have an Aussie living in Mayo, Barbara Barkley. I'm enjoying this talk more than most. Thank you. And she just said, what's the name of the lighthouse that you mentioned?
Palm Beach.
Palm Beach. Okay.
Palm Beach, New South Wales, Northern Beaches.
And why is Palm Beach famous, Marnie?
I don't know.
Because of the TV program, isn't it?
Oh, you might have seen Summer Bay. What's the show? Home and Away.
Home and Away. That's it.
It's filmed in Palm Beach. We don't watch it. So.
I've set it to record. Don't worry. One more. I think we're just coming up to 10:02. So one more question from Mary Comerford. Marnie and Fred, given your observations on phones and radio waves, is the proliferation of communication satellites in space affecting the astronomers' views of the heavens and increasing reflected light? Interesting.
Well, we should spend an hour talking about that. Yeah, because it's absolutely right. And it's not just radio astronomy, of course, it's optical astronomy, visible light astronomy as well. And the whole of the professional astronomical community is in discussion about how we deal with this, what the mitigating strategies that SpaceX and OneWeb and Amazon and the other operators might put in place will be. And I have to say, I was actually in a meeting yesterday where we discussed this, actually it was the day before yesterday, where we discussed this at great length, because the Australian Space Agency, our brand new space agency, is also involved in this whole business. So I have to say that certainly SpaceX, who are putting up the Starlink constellation, are keen to try and ensure that astronomical observations are not compromised. It's impossible to see how that will be, because they're beaming down radio signals into these telescopes that can actually pick up a mobile phone on its own on Pluto, and yet you've got these things 500 kilometers up that are beaming signals down. So there has to be further work. There will be further work. I think Elon Musk in particular he's kept saying we will make sure that there is zero effect on astronomical observations. That is not going to happen, but at least the sentiment is going in the right direction. So we're kind of optimistic. Fingers crossed that we'll arrive at a solution. Yeah,
well, that's a great way to sum up the questions, being optimistic, and there is future discussions indeed to be taken on that. I just took a quick poll while you were talking, asking people, have you seen both the night sky in both northern and southern hemispheres? And I'm just going to show the results. So we have, just out of interest, 57%, so 45%, 57 people saying yes, they have, and 71 no. So that's a target market for you, Marnie, for the future, again, when we can travel.
This is the Dark Sky Traveller.
Exactly. Well, listen, there's lots more questions coming in. I hope you don't mind if I perhaps package them up and we can send them on to you afterwards, and get some answers for those people. And thank you to everyone that asked questions, but especially thank you to you both for your time. I know it's very late. It's probably coming up to 11 o'clock p.m. your time. You're just going up outside. Yeah, sure. Okay, well, enjoy the night. Thank you so much, and for what's left of it, a happy Halloween to you, and we'll be talking soon. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Yeah, it's really been lovely.
It's an honor to be part of the conference. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.